I want to ask you a question that the British government, the palace, and every mainstream media outlet operating in this country are all, simultaneously and deliberately, refusing to ask in public. Not because they don't know the answer, but because the answer is so uncomfortable, so constitutionally destabilising, so fundamentally at odds with the carefully managed narrative that the institution of the monarchy depends upon for its very survival, that asking it out loud feels like pulling a thread that nobody wants to see unravel. What happens if Charles cannot recover? Not what happens when Charles dies. That process is constitutionally clear. Brutally, efficiently, mechanically clear. William becomes king the moment Charles draws his final breath. The Accession Council convenes within hours. Proclamations are read from the balcony of St. James's Palace. The machinery of succession executes itself with the cold precision of an institution that has been rehearsing that exact sequence for centuries. Every official knows their role. Every department has its protocol. Every broadcaster has its script ready and waiting in a drawer. That is not the question. The question, the one nobody will publicly ask, is what happens in the space between. The space between a king who is fighting cancer, whose operational capacity is measurably and visibly reduced, whose every public appearance is carefully choreographed, medically supported and institutionally managed to conceal the full extent of his physical limitations, and an heir who is already exercising operational authority without the constitutional framework that would make that authority formally legitimate, formally accountable, formally real. The space between Charles, as he currently is, and William, as he will eventually be. That space, that gap, that constitutional no-man's land. It has no clean legal resolution under the existing framework. It was never designed to have one. And Britain has been living inside it since February 2024, when Buckingham Palace confirmed to a stunned nation that the king had been diagnosed with cancer. It is still living inside it now. And the longer Britain remains in that gap, without a public conversation, without a parliamentary debate, without even the honest acknowledgement that the existing constitutional machinery has a significant hole in it, the more dangerous that gap becomes. Not theoretically dangerous. Not academically dangerous. Constitutionally, institutionally, politically dangerous in ways that could manifest with almost no warning and very little time to respond. Tonight, we go inside the constitutional crisis that Britain's establishment is hoping it can simply outrun. We map the legal architecture that should protect against it, expose precisely where that architecture fails, and lay out the specific scenarios that could transform a managed vulnerability into an unmanageable emergency. And we ask the question that the palace, the government, and the commentariat have all agreed in their quiet, powerful establishment way to leave unasked. Because hoping is not a governance strategy. And silence is not a solution. But before we go any further, if you are watching this channel for the first time, if someone has sent you this video or the algorithm has finally done something useful and brought you here, hit that subscribe button right now. Hit the like button. Because what we do here is different. We don't repeat the press release. We don't soften the edges to protect access. We follow the constitutional thread wherever it leads, and we tell you what it means. Every single week. And you are not going to want to miss what is coming in the final 3 topics of this series. So subscribe now. And let's get into it. To understand the constitutional vulnerability Britain is currently navigating, you need to understand what the existing framework was designed to do, and crucially, what it was never designed for. Because the gap at the centre of this crisis is not accidental. It is the product of a legal instrument written for a world that no longer exists, applied to a medical and political reality that its authors could never have anticipated. The Regency Act of 1937. This is the primary piece of legislation that governs what happens when a British monarch cannot perform their royal functions. It was passed in the shadow of the abdication crisis, in a moment when Parliament was acutely aware that the constitutional machinery for managing royal incapacity was dangerously inadequate. It was a serious piece of legislative work, and for the better part of 9 decades it has sat quietly in the background, invoked rarely, tested almost never, and largely forgotten by everyone except constitutional lawyers and the kind of political scientists who get invited onto Radio 4 at 11 o'clock at night. The Act establishes 2 key provisions for managing sovereign incapacity. First, if the sovereign is entirely incapable of performing royal functions due to mental or physical infirmity, a formal regency can be declared. The regent, in current circumstances William as heir apparent, would assume all royal functions on behalf of the incapacitated sovereign. The regent would sign legislation. The regent would chair Privy Council meetings. The regent would open Parliament, receive foreign heads of state, and exercise the full formal authority of the Crown in the Crown's name, but under the regent's hand. Second, if the sovereign is temporarily unable to perform specific, defined functions due to illness, absence from the country, or other temporary incapacity, councillors of state can be appointed to act in the sovereign's name for those specific purposes. This is a lighter mechanism, designed for shorter absences and more limited delegations. It has been used with some regularity throughout the modern era, when monarchs have been abroad or briefly unwell. These provisions, read together, sound comprehensive. They appear to cover the full spectrum of royal incapacity, from a brief illness to a permanent inability to function. They appear to give the constitutional machinery a clear answer for every scenario. They do not. They contain a gap. A gap so significant, so structurally serious, that constitutional lawyers have been quietly, carefully, and in certain cases privately, alarmed since the moment Charles's diagnosis became public knowledge. And the gap is this. The Regency Act requires a formal declaration of incapacity before a regency can be triggered. That declaration must be signed by specific constitutional officers, the Lord Chancellor, the Speakers of both Houses of Parliament, and the senior medical officers who have examined the sovereign, and it requires a definitive medical determination that the sovereign is wholly incapacitated, unable to perform any royal function whatsoever. Charles is not wholly incapacitated. He is partially incapacitated, variably incapacitated, managed with extraordinary care, incapacitated. He can sign documents on his better days. He can hold limited audiences with select visitors. He can appear in public for carefully timed, medically supported, institutionally managed engagements. His schedule is constructed with meticulous attention to his energy levels, his treatment cycle, and the medical realities of what his body can sustain. Under the Regency Act's legal threshold, this does not constitute the incapacity required to trigger a formal regency. He is not wholly unable to perform royal functions. He is performing some of them, some of the time, with significant support and within significant limitations. But it also, and this is the crucial point, does not constitute the functional capacity required to run a modern constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. Not even close. A modern constitutional monarchy requires a sovereign who can consistently, reliably, publicly discharge a full suite of constitutional functions. State opening of Parliament, weekly audiences with the Prime Minister, Privy Council meetings, the formal reception of foreign heads of state. The signing of legislation. The reading of government papers. The quiet, constant, largely invisible constitutional work that the sovereignty requires every single week. Britain is stuck between two legal thresholds. Above the level of incapacity that would trigger the formal constitutional mechanisms of the Regency Act, and below the level of capacity that the role of sovereign actually requires in practice. And in that gap, that legally unaddressed, politically unacknowledged, institutionally managed gap, the United Kingdom has been operating for over a year, with no public debate, no parliamentary discussion, no constitutional reform process, no honest public accounting of the risk. Just management and hope. Let us map the specific constitutional functions that have been managed or partially managed or carefully choreographed under the current arrangement throughout 2024 and into 2025. Because the specifics reveal the fragility of the system in ways that the general description obscures. The state opening of Parliament. November 2024. This is one of the most constitutionally significant events in the British parliamentary calendar. It is not a piece of ceremonial theatre that can be quietly postponed or redesigned for convenience. The monarch must read the King's speech from the throne in the House of Lords. The parliamentary session cannot be formally opened without it. It is a constitutional requirement that sits at the intersection of monarchy, parliament, and government, and it requires a sovereign who can physically be present, publicly visible, and constitutionally functional. Charles attended. He delivered the speech. The constitutional function was performed, and the cameras recorded it, and the nation watched, and the newspapers reported on how well he looked and what it meant for his recovery. But what the cameras did not record, what the newspapers did not report, was the extraordinary level of medical and logistical preparation that surrounded that appearance. The contingency planning was in place if he became acutely unwell during the ceremony. The careful management of his schedule in the days preceding the event to conserve his energy for a single peak performance. The medical support was positioned out of public sight. The institutional anxiety in the days leading up to it, and the question that palace legal advisers were privately asking in the weeks before it. A simple question, and an alarming one. What is the contingency if Charles cannot physically attend on the day? The technical answer exists. William, as a Councillor of State, could read the speech on Charles's behalf. The constitutional function would be performed. The parliamentary session would be opened. The machinery of government would continue to turn. But a Councillor of State performing the state opening of Parliament, reading the King's speech from the throne in the King's absence due to illness, is constitutionally unprecedented in the modern era. It would not simply be a constitutional substitution. It would be a public event of enormous significance, broadcast live to the nation, that would make the question of Charles's capacity and William's de facto authority impossible to avoid. Every newspaper the following morning, every television bulletin that evening, every political commentator in the country, all asking the same question. The question the palace has worked relentlessly to prevent from being asked. Is Charles still capable of being king? And then there is the Privy Council, the formal constitutional body through which royal assent is given to orders in council, through which the actual, technical, legal machinery of British governance operates on a weekly basis. The council has been meeting with modified procedures throughout Charles's illness. The King's physical attendance at certain meetings has been reduced. The constitutional work continues to be done. But the specific mechanisms by which it is done, which councillors of state sign which documents, which functions Charles performs directly and which are delegated, precisely who is doing what in the name of the Crown, have not been publicly disclosed. This opacity is not accidental. It is a deliberate institutional choice. And it is a choice that reveals, with great clarity, exactly what the palace understands to be at stake. The appearance of normality is itself a constitutional asset. If the public believes the monarchy is functioning normally, if the documents are being signed, the speeches are being delivered, the audiences are being held, the institutional business of the crown is proceeding, then public confidence in the institution is maintained. The constitutional machinery continues to operate, lubricated by a collective national assumption that everything is as it should be. The moment that public confidence fractures, the moment the question shifts from the reassuring, "Is Charles managing?" to the genuinely alarming, "Who is actually running this?" the constitutional gap ceases to be a quiet institutional problem and becomes a very public constitutional crisis. And in 2025, with Charles's treatment ongoing and no publicly stated timeline for recovery, the question of how long the appearance of normality can be sustained is one that serious constitutional scholars are beginning to ask with genuine and escalating urgency. Let us now do something that the British establishment refuses categorically and collectively refuses to do in public. Let us map the scenarios. Not to be alarmist, not to be morbid, but because mapping scenarios is what serious governance requires, and the refusal to do it publicly is itself a failure of governance that needs to be named and called out for precisely what it is. Scenario 1. Charles recovers sufficiently to resume fuller operational duties. This is the scenario the palace presents publicly, and the outcome that Charles's medical team is, publicly, working toward. In this scenario, the constitutional gap closes naturally over time. Charles returns to a fuller level of function. William's expanded operational role normalises into the standard heir apparent preparation that has always been part of the monarchy's institutional logic. The Regency Act's provisions remain in the background, never triggered, never formally tested, filed away as a constitutional mechanism that was there if needed and, in the end, mercifully, was not needed. This is the best-case scenario. It is the scenario the institution is banking on. It is also, and this must be said with complete honesty, the scenario that carries the greatest medical uncertainty, because the nature of the cancer treatment Charles has been undergoing does not permit confident timelines or guaranteed outcomes. Scenario 2. Charles's condition stabilises at current levels, managed but significantly reduced for an extended period. Months. Perhaps longer. This is the scenario Britain is currently living in. And it is the scenario that the existing constitutional framework handles least well. In this scenario, the informal William as operating king arrangement, never formally declared, never constitutionally legitimised, never publicly acknowledged for what it actually is, continues indefinitely. The constitutional gap persists. The appearance of normality is maintained through increasingly intensive institutional management. And the longer this continues, the more the informal arrangement becomes, in practice and in institutional expectation, a permanent feature of how the British state actually operates. At some point in a prolonged scenario 2, the gap between formal constitutional reality and operational reality becomes so wide that a single event, a Charles hospitalisation, a public appearance where his incapacity cannot be successfully managed, a constitutional function that physically cannot be performed, could force the crisis that the existing framework is not equipped to resolve cleanly. Not because the machinery doesn't exist, but because the machinery was never designed for the specific pressure that a prolonged managed incapacity creates. Scenario 3. Charles's condition deteriorates significantly and rapidly. This is the scenario that nobody in public life will discuss. The scenario that is simultaneously the most constitutionally consequential and the most institutionally unplanned for. In this scenario, the constitutional machinery must be activated. And it must activate quickly, under conditions of intense public emotion, extraordinary media pressure, and institutional anxiety that represent the worst possible environment for anything requiring careful constitutional improvisation. The Regency Act's threshold must be met and formally declared. The Lord Chancellor must act. The speakers of both houses must act. The senior medical officers required to certify complete incapacity must make their formal determination. These officers must act with speed, consensus, and constitutional clarity in circumstances where everything around them is moving fast, and the public is watching, and the media is demanding answers, and the political class is simultaneously processing the human reality of a monarch in extremis. William must assume formal authority. Not the informal, carefully managed, publicly unacknowledged authority he has been exercising for the past year. Formal authority. Regent's authority. With all the constitutional weight and public visibility that entails, in circumstances where the public narrative is simultaneously processing the very real possibility that the king is dying. Scenario 3 does not give the institution time to manage appearances. It does not give it weeks to prepare, or even days to get the relevant parties in the same room. It gives it hours. And in those hours, it must execute a constitutional transition that the existing framework was not comprehensively designed for, and that has not been formally rehearsed in the modern era. And here is the specific detail that makes Scenario 3 most profoundly alarming. The constitutional officers responsible for executing that transition, the Lord Chancellor, the speakers of both houses, the senior medical officers required to certify incapacity, have not, so far as any publicly available information suggests, been brought into any formal preparedness process. There is no publicly known constitutional rehearsal for this scenario. No known tabletop exercise in which the relevant parties have walked through the specific sequence of steps required. No publicly acknowledged framework for managing accelerated constitutional transition under emergency conditions. There is the Regency Act, written in 1937. For a world that bore only passing resemblance to the one we currently inhabit. And there is a palace that is managing day by day in the hope that Scenario 1 arrives before Scenario 3 becomes a question it must answer in real time. Now let us take the long view. Because the constitutional crisis potential or actual demands it. The British monarchy has survived things that would have destroyed almost any other institution on earth. It has survived the trauma of the Civil War and the brief, uncomfortable experiment of the English Republic. It survived the madness of George III, a genuine, prolonged, constitutionally destabilising royal incapacity that tested the machinery of the state in ways that remain instructive today. It has survived the abdication crisis of 1936, which was as close as the modern monarchy has come to existential institutional collapse. It survived 2 world wars, the loss of an empire, the transformation of Britain from global power to medium-sized island nation, and the extraordinary social and cultural changes of the 20th century. It survived the death of Diana. It survived the years of internal family warfare that saw one generation of the royal family publicly fracture in ways that would have broken most dynasties. It survived the death of the Queen, perhaps the single most beloved individual in the history of the modern British state, and the transfer of public affection and institutional trust to a new monarch with a complicated public history and an uncertain public reception. It has survived all of these things, not because its constitutional framework is perfect, the current crisis demonstrates with uncomfortable clarity that it is not, but because the people inside the institution have consistently and often remarkably found ways to manage the gap between what the framework formally provides and what the situation actually requires. Management. Quiet, skilled, deeply English constitutional management. The ability to hold things together through convention and deference and the collective unspoken agreement of sufficiently powerful people to behave as though a system is working even when its mechanics are under severe strain. To maintain the appearance of normality, because the appearance of normality is not mere performance, it is itself a form of constitutional stability. It is load-bearing. It holds weight. That particular constitutional genius, that specifically British capacity for institutional management under pressure, is being tested right now in ways that have no clean modern precedent. And the question is not whether the institution can manage the crisis. History suggests it probably can. The question is what the cost of managing it is, and whether the lessons it teaches will actually be learned. Because William is watching all of this. William has been living inside this constitutional gap for over a year. He has been the one performing the functions, fielding the calls, managing the institutional weight of a role he does not yet formally hold, in service of a constitutional framework that does not formally acknowledge what he is doing. He knows where the gaps are. He knows where the machinery creaks. He knows better than any constitutional scholar writing from the outside precisely what it feels like to operate in the space between what the law says and what the situation requires. And when, not if, but when William becomes king, he will inherit not just the crown and the palaces and the constitutional authority. He will inherit the constitutional framework that the current crisis has exposed as inadequate. He will inherit the Regency Act. He will inherit the managed opacity. He will inherit the institutional habits and the institutional silences that have allowed a genuine constitutional vulnerability to persist without public acknowledgement for over a year. He will face a choice that no one is currently publicly formally asking him to make. He can inherit the framework as it stands. He can be crowned, assume formal authority, take his place on the throne, and leave the Regency Act to the constitutional historians as a curious document about a crisis that was successfully managed without breaking. He can allow the silence to continue. He can maintain the institutional habit of managing appearances. He can govern the way the monarchy has always governed, by holding things together through the sheer weight of institutional convention, and hoping that the gaps don't open at the worst possible moment. Or he can do something the British monarchy has done very rarely in its extraordinarily long history. He can reform, not the monarchy's values, not its ceremonial role, not the relationship with the public that is the institution's deepest and most durable source of legitimacy. Not the things that make people stand in the rain for 12 hours to watch a royal procession pass. Those things are not what needs reforming. What needs reforming is the legal and constitutional machinery. The specific legislative architecture that governs how power formally transfers when the human beings at the centre of the institution are not able to perform as the architecture assumes they will. The threshold provisions of the Regency Act, written for a binary world of functioning or definitively incapacitated, with nothing in between. The opacity around councillors of state and their specific powers and limitations. The absence of any formal, transparent, publicly understood process for managing the gap between a sovereign who is present but limited and an heir who is capable but constitutionally uncredentialed. A reformed Regency Act. A clearer, more nuanced threshold for what constitutes operational incapacity in the medical realities of the 21st century. A formal, transparent parliamentary process for managing the situation when a monarch is not wholly incapacitated but not fully functional either. Mechanisms that do not require choosing between the fiction of full capacity and the constitutional drama of a formal regency. Mechanisms that acknowledge the medical and human reality of gradual, managed, variable incapacity, and that give the constitutional machinery a way to respond to it that does not depend entirely on the good judgment and successful management of a small group of palace officials working without formal framework or public accountability. William has the opportunity, emerging from this crisis, having lived through it from the inside in a way that no future king will quite replicate, to leave the monarchy's constitutional framework meaningfully stronger than he found it. To do the reforming work that the current crisis has made obviously necessary, and to do it from a position of genuine personal understanding of exactly why it matters. Whether he takes that opportunity, whether the institution that has survived everything by managing appearances can summon the institutional courage to reform in the open, transparently, through Parliament, with public debate and democratic accountability, rather than simply managing the next gap the way it managed this one. That is the question that will define William's reign as surely as any individual policy or public decision. It is the constitutional legacy question, and it does not yet have an answer. Here is what I want you to sit with after you finish watching this. Should Britain update the Regency Act publicly, transparently, through democratic parliamentary process, to reflect the medical realities and constitutional complexities of the 21st century? Or does attempting to formally reform the constitutional machinery risk exposing the very vulnerabilities that successful management has been carefully concealing, and in exposing them, destabilising the very public confidence that the institution depends upon? This is not a theoretical question. It is the most important constitutional question Britain is currently not publicly having. And the fact that it is not being discussed in Parliament, not in the serious press, not in the public square where these questions belong in a functioning democracy, is itself a story. A significant, troubling, consequential story about how Britain governs itself, and about the price of an institutional culture that has always preferred management to transparency. Leave your answer in the comments. Because this conversation needs to happen somewhere, and if the establishment will not have it, then we will have it here. If you have made it to the end of this video, you already know that this channel does not do this the way everyone else does it. We follow the thread. We show the machinery. We ask the question that is actually worth asking, not the question that is safe to ask. Topics 18, 19, and 20 are coming. And they bring every thread of this entire series together, every door we have opened, every question we have asked, into a conclusion that will reframe everything that came before it. You do not want to arrive at the end of this series without having seen what comes next. Subscribe now. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who thinks they already know how the monarchy works. Because they do not know this part. And this part is the one that matters.